Thank you, Umberto. Thank you, first of all, for demonstrating to us with a display of wit and erudition in what must be your third or fourth language, exactly what the business of civilization and criticism is all about. So thank you very much for that to begin with. And let me say, I want to make sure that I understand what you were proposing in your lecture, and that we all understand it, because it seems to me very provocative. If I, having read your lecture, now hearing it, if you could sum it up in a phrase, it would be, am I right, that we value fiction not because it proposes freedom to us, but because it pictures fate for us. That is, because its inescapable, unchangeable nature reminds us of the inescapable and unchangeable nature of our own destinies. So it's not an exercise in the freedom of creation, the freedom of fantasy. It's just the opposite.
Probably at the beginning it was, but for us it is not. And it is important for our notion of truth, because we can discuss for years apropos of truth. And everybody has his own idea of truth, but we are accustomed to the fact that in this world, truth can always be casted in doubt. Even the truth of faith, one can lose his faith.
One's belief in a...
So, truth is an evanescent object, very difficult to define philosophically. The literary, the fictional truth is
Absolutely.
a terrible example of real, indisputable truth. Is the way we can still speak of truth knowing what it should be.
So that the fate of King Lear is, in a certain sense, much more real than the fate of Napoleon, because
yes, and what the truth of King Lear tells us what we should think about the truth of Napoleon. I mean, there is something profoundly philosophical in this phenomenon, that only narrative provides an indisputable notion of truth. Even the Bible, you can find a Muslim who doesn't agree, or a Buddhist that
we have four Gospels that tell the story differently.
Okay, no. But a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Christian must agree that Superman is Clark Kent.
Well, let's come to that.
The Pope and the Dalai Lama must agree on the fact that Superman is Clark Kent.
Well, let's come back to that case, Umberto, because after all, in this day of criticism, we all know of certain critical methods that insist that Superman may not be Clark Kent, that we could interpret the comic book that it's simply a paranoid fantasy of Lois Lane's, that Superman is Clark Kent, that it is that we are to understand the comic that Schuster and Siegel intended us to understand, that it is a fantasy of Clark Kent's that he would be Superman, which in a certain odd sense is probably true, or that it's a fantasy of the two Jewish boys who made it, and so on. In other words, at this moment at least, we give enormous leeway to certain kinds of critical interpretation that insist that Superman may not be Clark Kent, and that part of it may be unstable. But you're rejecting that.
This is an American disease. This is an American disease and a heritage of France.
Yes.
So, you know, like...
all of our illnesses come from France.
Syphilis, that the Italians said that it was coming from France, and the French say that
comes
it
from
was
America.
From Italy,
right.
At the time of the Pavia battle. So, deconstruction is an American production on French license. But the American deconstruction is not the one of Derrida.
No.
Because Derrida was saying that in front of a philosophical text, we have to interpret the maybe hidden and profound reasons of that philosophical statement. Why deconstruction in this country frequently say, in criticism we can do everything we want of a text. I don't believe it for the reasons I said. We cannot continue to imagine what happened with the first bullet of Julien. It doesn't exist, okay? Finished. No, it doesn't belong to the world of Stendhal. If you want to continue to fantasmer, as the French say about that, that is a problem for you and your psychoanalyst, but not for literature.
Right. But it's certainly true that Derrida's version of deconstruction has much more to do with not with the instability of the text in the sense it means whatever you want it to mean, but with the notion that we can't come up with one authoritative, there's no one author in that sense, no one power. All right, that's certainly true.
You know, I have written a book, because you know that I am fundamentally a scholar that during the weekends writes novels.
Yes.
The title is The Limit of Interpretation. It's a provocative title because my first book was called The Open Work, and it was on the absolute freedom of interpretation. But in fact, I was always saying the same thing. The interpretation of a text can be infinite. Okay, as far as a text is artistically valuable, it can produce new readings ad infinitum, indeed. But that means that we cannot say always even interpretation is a good one. But we can always say even interpretation is a bad one, because it is rejected by the text.
Right. Well,
so I made the example, you can do everything with the text, and we can write an essay in which you demonstrate that D'Artagnan was homosexual. Well, he spent his time making love with Milady, with Constance Bonacieux, etc. It's very difficult to
but
find
that's the
text.
proof, right?
The text says no. Maybe Aramis, but not D'Artagnan.
Certainly Aramis, right?
And not Porthos.
Right.
No.
Isn't it one of the... Well, that leads to something we were talking about a moment ago, because you've been talking about fiction today, but in a sense, all human understanding begins with stories, with fictions, with narratives, things that reach beyond what's immediately there in front of us. 3-year-old children make up stories, and evolutionary biologists make up stories.
Yes, I always am sure that not only every kind of literature has a narrative structure, even a poem, okay? But that every kind, even of scientific definition, has a narrative structure, because science doesn't say a tree is a vegetal. No, it says you take a seed, put it in the earth, make it to grow. Right? Tells the story how a tree can be produced. So the narrativity stands at the heart of every human knowledge, a human effort to produce and to communicate knowledge.
And if I understand you, you think the special quality of fiction within that whole universe of storytelling, of making up stories, is exactly, it's the most stable in a certain way. It reminds us of it's the one that where we can, not where we have the freest range of interpretation, but in the sense where we have the least range of...
Yes, and then there is the co-textual pressure. The most advanced literary critics lived in the 4th century, 5th, it was St. Augustine. And he elaborated a hermeneutical theory about the reading of the Bible. Say, suppose that at the page 5, you find the sentence and you believe it can be interpreted in this way. Keep cool, go on with the text. Probably at the page 1003, you can find a sentence that contradicts your interpretation. In that case, your interpretation is false. If you don't, maybe you can try to. So it's the co-textual pressure that tells us, and this asks for a sort of, we have to remain faithful to the text. We cannot change it. But if not, as a game, okay, we can do it this evening, trying to imagine a different Three Musketeers, a different...
the gay Three Musketeers or the paranoid Superman.
But they marry Superman. So.
Right. But where do we understand, because one of the things that makes reading literature remarkable is that we know certain things that don't count. We know Hamlet didn't marry Ophelia. We know that he didn't survive at the end of the story. We know lots of things. but we don't know why he delays. We don't know why. In other words, there seems to be that in every...
That is the beauty of the infinity of interpretation. So you see, I am not saying that a text says only one thing, we have to realize it and stop, it's finished. No, it produces infinite interpretation. But you have always to check your interpretation on the text. You said that Hamlet delays. You didn't say that Hamlet was a quick revenger. Mm-hmm. No, the text tells us that
he was not.
Delays. Yes. He sends back. That's as the power of the text. Then there is the freedom of the interpreter that tries to say, oh, my God, why? And there are many interpretations, but the most beautiful one is the one of Eliot, is that because Hamlet is a bad text in which Shakespeare put together
two different books.
He was unable to cope with them. And so it is considered beautiful because, fascinating because it's beautiful, while on the contrary, it's beautiful because it's fascinating. Yes. Intriguing.
Well, you know, that's a common idea now among Shakespeare interpreters, that one of the things that Shakespeare always does when he borrows a text is he eliminates the motives. That in the story of King Lear that he takes from Holinshed, there's a clear motive. There's a very clear explanation of why Lear gives away his kingdom. But Shakespeare eliminates the motive and makes the play. So, in a sense, Umberto, what you're saying, if I understand you, is you're proposing for us a kind of very rational view of literature and literary criticism, in the sense that it is sort of like a scientific theory. We create it, and then we test it against something that is fixed, something that we can actually...
I encourage slow reading. Mm-hmm. Instead
slow reading?
Yes. Uh-huh. Instead of my friend Lindsay Waters, the editor-in-chief of Harvard University Press, humanities section, is writing many articles about slow reading, like it is slow food, slow reading, because quick reading cannot work.
That's fascinating, Umberto. Can you enlarge on that? What's the difference between a quick reading of a text and the slow reading of a text? It's like fast...
The quick reading is immediately to superimpose on the text the first interpretation that comes to my mind. Mm-hmm. So, slow reading, okay, I give you a good example of slow reading. I am a very modest person, but in that case I am the best example of slow reading. A few years ago, I translated the text I most love in the world, Sylvie by Gerard de Nerval. It took me 40 years. It's a text of 60 pages. For 40 years, since December 52, when I was in Paris and I saw something marvelous, people reading in the metro. So I tried to buy something very small to read in the metro. I came across the Gerard de Nerval Sylvie, and I fell in love. So in many courses in my university, here at Columbia once, every year I spoke about Sylvie. I read it and reread. And after 50, 40, 90, after 40 years, I said, maybe it's time to translate it. And by translating it, I discovered things that I hadn't discovered during my 40 years of reading. Because only the moment in which you have to translate it, you have to understand if there is a rhythm to be saved and so on. I confess that I discovered only 40 years later that in all the oniric situation, there are in the text, which is prose, hidden verses that the reader mustn't realize they are there, but must feel a sort of unconscious affect. And that poetic rhythm then must give him or her the impression of being dreaming. But I discovered it only because in order to translate the text, you have also to read it aloud, as you have to recite it. And at this point, in 40 years, I never read it aloud. And then finally, that's slow reading.
That's very
and fidelity,
slow interpretation.
and fidelity to the text. Even though I can propose you 2,000 possible interpretations of certain elements of Sylvie.
Would it benefit the reader of the translation to read it over 40 years in the same way? In the same way that Joyce said that Finnegan's Wake should be...
For an ideal reader affected by an ideal insomnia, yes. But I don't know if the translation resulted in being a good one just because I read for 40 years, because there are beautiful translations of Sylvie made by people who read it only for 6 months. But I am dull.
It's finished.
Probably.
It's finished.
Published.
Published,
Yes,
published and revisited. Umberto, one of the things that sort of preoccupies the arts and leisure section in Sunday papers and television here is enormous melodramatic energy about the difference between memoir and fiction, about what's permissible in something that's published as autobiography or memoir and what can only be done in fiction. Do you think that's a legitimate distinction? Do you think that's a significant distinction, or is that one that exists only sort of in the...
But listen, a theoretician made a distinction between what they call natural narrative and artificial narrative. The natural narrative is the one of the New York Times, newspaper. They are supposed to tell the truth, what really happened. It's a narrative. President Bush went there and there.
That's why they call them stories. Right.
That's a story. Yeah. It's a story, but we want that story to be true. Mm-hmm. And if by chance we discover that the newspaper didn't tell the truth, artificial narrative is, on the contrary, what we call a fiction. We accept the idea that it is. Our autobiographies and memoirs. I think that since nobody of us remember his or her own past perfectly, memoir is a continuous rewriting. I remember that when I was 10 years old, I did so and so and so. It happened to me once to discover that it was not that. My memory was the result of further experience. So I rewrote my story. So even though the author is honest, there can be false autobiography in which somebody wants to demonstrate that he didn't do something or did. Always an autobiography is a mixture of natural and artificial narrative.
Do the best autobiographies tend to be more artificial narratives like Chateaubriand?
And I don't think that there is a clear-cut rule. It's a sort of continuum from alpha to omega. Some autobiographies are very close to omega, and some other very close to alpha.
Yes. We were talking backstage. I have a clear memory of meeting you when I was 10 years old, but I suspect that was part of the artificial narrative. Now,
yes, probably. I was an author. Yes. I was an author. Yes,
exactly.
I remember that the day I was an author. Yes, sure.
Yes. Coming to something you're talking about in the second part of your lecture tonight, you were talking about how the world of the hyperlink alters our notions of storytelling, what we can do with stories. And I was wondering, as I was listening to you, if in a sense, isn't that, if you couldn't argue that it was the reverse, that is, that in the past, when literature has had a central place, fiction has had a central place in our imaginations, that people weren't maniacally hyperlinking, in effect, all the time. So Falstaff is invented by Shakespeare, and then Queen Elizabeth says, put him in a comedy, and Shakespeare has to put him in a comedy, and then he has an existence outside it. If in a sense that in our own civilization, where literature, sadly, perhaps, plays a somewhat smaller part for the whole culture, that in fact we don't have more limited hyperlinking of literature than we did.
In fact, the hyperlinks of the web are only the mechanical perfectioning of something that existed before. Simply, I can do it in a second. But suppose this is a book. What is that? What is a book full of, how do you call them? ears. We call orecchie in Italian.
You mean
Yes.
turn downs? Dog ears. Dog
Eh?
ears. Dog ears.
Or you put pieces of paper, and at the end, like take the more hypertextual text, with the Bible. Nobody has ever read the Bible from the beginning to the end, if it is not crazy. The Bible is read hypertextually, so that at the end you have read probably everything, but jumping from one point to another, then coming back, then returning 3 times to the same page, skipping certain other pages. We have always used the text hypertextually. Simply, the modern hypertext allows us to do it more rapidly, but sometimes it can produce the absence of the manual operation to retrieve your. It is not the phone book in hypertextual structure with the letter of the alphabet that you can open. A normal agenda is in hypertext. We are living hypertextually. There are few cases in which we read the text textually. Criminal stories, from the beginning to the end.
True crime, true.
Not to sleep before the end. Okay, and that's that. But all the rest, the great literature is read. I think nobody has read Finnegan's Wake from the beginning to the end. I think not even Richard Hellman. So,
not even Joyce.
I hope.
Not even Joyce himself.
Not even Joyce, because his sight was.
Well, if that's true, Umberto, then that's a somewhat optimistic picture of the future of literature, because you see it as on a continuum. In other words, the people who say that something fundamentally has changed with the birth of choose your poison, the internet or hypertextuality, that the condition of our experience of writing has changed. It seems you take the opposite view, that it's almost as though we're all medieval monks now, living in a scriptorium with...
No, listen. I deal with computers as I deal with my car. My car is very useful for certain things, but with a car I risk to kill myself in a highway. So there are several aspects of a car, and I had to be always prudent and suspicious. As far as hypertextuality, internet and many other devices, from the e-book to the old CD-ROM that by now is completely out, have perfectioned old trends and tendencies. Okay. Moreover, it's really a pity that McLuhan died too early, because he who said that the Gutenberg galaxy had finished and there was the era of image, today would recognize that the computer has brought again the Gutenberg galaxy.
Yes, no,
everybody is obliged to read. To read, and now even illiterate people is obliged to write.
Yes.
So I love you, but okay. But at least they have to write it. So in this case, the computer produces a new kind of literacy.
Enforces a new kind of literacy.
The risk of the computer, of the web, is that when you have too much information, that equals no information. I have an old story that I have repeated so many times, that there was no difference between the Sunday New York Times and the Pravda of the Stalin times. The Pravda said nothing. All was censored. The Sunday New York Times says too much. A week is not enough to read it. So you lose a lot of information in both cases. And the web is so. Not only an abundance of information, but no instruction of how to discriminate. You go in a bookstore and you see a book published, let's say, Columbia University Press. More or less, there has been somebody who has controlled the Then you see another Knight Templars University Press. Okay, it's trash, and you don't buy it. In internet, even if there is edu, it doesn't mean that it's made by a university, but simply that somebody has paid to. So, if you know, or you already know the subject matter, you can control the site and say, this, well, it's okay, this is crazy. But if you don't know, and it is the case of young people, not specialized people, you cannot know if what is told you is true or false. Is the work of a
Holocaust denier,
of a mad doctor, or sometimes it's difficult to discriminate between a Hebrew site and a new Nazi site. Mm-hmm. If you don't know very well the language, the jargon, no? And
the code words that the code words that are
the code word. And this is an enormous tragedy in the sense that what should be taught in the school would be the art of discrimination. But not even the professors know that. So we have to form a new category of teachers. Then the art of discrimination is not transmitted through, I don't know, sentence or... It's a practice every day to work together.
To discriminate, to distinguish.
I don't think that, right. That I propose in a school you should give. That is the subject. Then each of you finds 10 sides of that subject and tries to say which one are reliable and which one are not. So the young people are educated to confrontation, and they could reach some result by confronting different sides. But that is the real risk. And the real risk is that 6 billion inhabitants of the planet can compose 6 billion of encyclopedias. While the role of an encyclopedia is to provide to me and to you a common ground to discuss. Even in order to prove that you are wrong, we need a common encyclopedia to refer to it. Even in order to prove that Galileo was right, that Ptolemy was wrong, you need the works of Ptolemy in order to start from there. Mm-hmm. With internet, the risk is everybody makes up her own encyclopedia, and the planet with 6 billion encyclopedias is a planet in which there is no more communication. Well, that is a little apocalyptic, but it's always good to keep in mind the risks.
Well, the good thing about that is if you have that task for students, and they do that now in primary schools in America. They say, can you discriminate between what's truth and lies? They have to go back to the bookstore and to the library.
And to check also in books, to be sure that the site... That can be an interesting challenge.
Yes, so
in any case, to create in the mind of the young user a basic suspicion.
Which is the heart of critical thinking, the heart of intellectual.
Okay.
So that exactly what the internet should create is enormous suspicion rather than infinite credulity in the world. All right, like that. We were talking backstage a bit about exactly the internet and something that I think any European has to feel strongly about or have feelings about, and that is the dominance or even the hegemony of English and of the English language, something that we bathe in here, but that it's said at least that the internet has been a very powerful engine in turning English into a kind of prison, which prevents...
but internet is also... you know that in the 19th century, they wanted to introduce in Texas the teaching of foreign languages, and the senator opposed that law, saying, if English was enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it would be enough also for us. So it can happen that some people don't have the feeling of the plurality of language. Internet is not only a machinery to navigate through which you must read English. is also a machinery that helps you to discover how many other languages exist in the world. You fall upon Japanese sites, Czech sites. For many people, it's the first time they have the sensation of the plurality of language. So it's not only the indispensable presence of English as a universal pidgin. Yes, okay.
Which you agree has happened?
I don't agree or disagree. Languages are biological entities. They do what they want.
Independent of anyone.
No political power never succeeded in imposing a given language. So if English is now the general pidgin, that's that. In the same sense in which there is a hole in the ozone and Australia is south of Finland. Okay, it's a fact. It's a fact. Maybe in a while it will be Chinese. That's up to you. But it's a fact. So nothing to... Not one shouldn't moralize about languages.
It's a neutral fact.
Languages are biological. They do what they want.
That raises the question of having lived in Europe for a while. There is nonetheless a certain, what shall we call it, suspicion, paranoia, fear of not only of the internet but of American civilization, particularly, simply eradicating differences. This is not a fear that you share or think is dignified?
But not so much, because what is believed to be the process of Americanization is in fact a continuous process of creolization.
Creolization.
Creolization. So a new language. Once they discovered that the East was invaded by blue jeans, and then it was discovered that those blue jeans were an Italian production made in Trieste and sold in the... Were still they American? Yes, because the first inspiration, but there was already a creolization, that the McDonald's, the place in Italy, started to make pizza.
The McDonald's in Italy started...
ruining the pizza.
Yes, it's like the most successful takeout operation in pizza in France is called Speed Rabbit, which you would never tolerate here.
Eh?
Speed Rabbit.
Speed.
Speed Rabbit, exactly. Yes, which you could never do here from fear, Americans' fear of...
Yes, the country who is more terrified by the American model and the English is certainly France, because they have lost the importance of French language.
The centrality of French.
The centrality of French language. But they react sometimes frantically, for instance, by calling logiciel the software, while in the rest of the world, now everybody understands software, and I have listened in the French radio saying les ouvriers sont à risque de perdre leur job. Why job? In French there is travail,
boulot.
Emploi, boulot. It was possible to tell it in beautiful French. Why job? And then they call logiciel the
software.
So is a moment, is a very embarrassing moment. Well, I love French. Is the foreign language I speak better.
You were saying that when you were starting out that was in some sense the defining characteristic of an Italian intellectual.
Yes,
someone who spoke
no
French.
Italian intellectual could be an intellectual if he or she didn't know French. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now the new generation of my students doesn't understand French, and I was telling before, I invited Julia Kristeva, and she spoke in English.
I find and the world tottered on its axis at that moment. I still find that hard.
Obviously, for the PhD program, we check that they know also French, and we select those who at least know 2 or 3 foreign languages. But the rank and file, no, they don't.
Umberto, moving a little bit aside from the topic of your lecture, You are a frequent visitor to America, and with the endless insularity, if not narcissism, of Americans, I'm sure we're all curious about your sense of where this country is at this moment, what your impressions are of us.
A man who lives in the country of Berlusconi cannot judge.
For those of us who live in the country of Bush can only ask for judgment.
Apropos of French, you know, there is a beautiful story on Bush. It seems that after a trip to Paris, he said, "Oh, how strange. The French don't have a word for entrepreneur."
Yes. Well, yes, that's like the story about, they always used to say Nixon and Kissinger back in the 70s, remember, said, there's no word in Russian for détente. Well, there's no word in English for détente either.
Listen, my Russian translator was asked in Moscow, how do you call mafia in Italian? True.
That's true.
They now believe it's a typical Russian
word because well, it's an Italian export into the
pizza and mafia. Yes,
to the whole world. I mean, we were talking before. You came of age at a time when a certain kind of international culture was still, if not in place, was at least felt possible. That is, a certain respect for a demand to learn many languages and a certain kind of cosmopolitan culture still in place in Europe and America. Are you confident that's one of the things that this organization and that this festival celebrates and posits, makes seem important? Are you... I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think that events like this can be very useful because writer coming together can create a sort of lobby and of pressure group about capital problems like freedom of speech and things like that, while the isolated writer is vox clamantis in desert, writes an article, while the fact that here has been the discussion between Rushdie and Saviano about censure and menaces life risk for certain writers, it's enormously important because it makes visible certain fundamental moral problems. Yes.
And what do you feel, and those fundamental moral problems are?
No, for instance, I said the problem of censure, of freedom of speech. There are a lot of countries in which this doesn't exist. I mean, I remember when I was a young man, I was invited to Spain at the times of Franco, and being a premature anti-fascist, as the Lincoln Brigade, I said, no, I don't go in a country under dictatorship. And then the Spanish friend said, you're crazy. We need you come. Because you come, you create a debate, there is a public discussion, so each of you coming there helps us. The same happens with an organization like the PAN Club, makes certain fundamental problems visible also in countries in which they are ignored or censured. So, even though, contrary to what, for instance, in Europe, journalists believe that intellectuals and writers have a solution for every problem, which is false, at least sometime they can make a pressure group and to have some influence.
Well, I can't imagine a better or more modest or more accurate description of the purposes of this past week. And as it comes to an end, Umberto, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.